Good day, students. It's a pleasure to be here with you once more. Today we're going to see a video on the difference between classical and operant conditioning. Since we started the session on learning last class, we're going to do a little review on the difference between both classical and operant conditioning, and we will finish off with observational learning by Albert Bandura. Once we have done that, then we're going to move on to chapter 8, which has to do with behavior in social context. So let's begin today's class with a video where we'll be looking at the difference between classical and operant conditioning.
When we think about learning, we often picture students in a classroom or lecture hall, books open on their desk, listening intently to a teacher or professor in the front of the room. But in psychology, learning means something else. To psychologists, learning is a long-term change in behavior that's based on experience. Two of the main types of learning are called classical conditioning and operant or instrumental conditioning. Let's talk about classical conditioning first. In the 1890s, a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov did some really famous experiments on dogs. He showed dogs some food and rang a bell at the same time. After a while, the dogs would associate the bell with the food. They would learn that when they heard the bell, they would get fed. Eventually, just ringing the bell made the dogs salivate. They learned to expect food at the sound of a bell. You see, under normal conditions, the sight and smell of food causes a dog to salivate. We call the food an unconditioned stimulus, and we call salivation an unconditioned response. Nobody trains a dog to salivate over some steak. However, when we pair an unconditioned stimulus like food with something that was previously neutral, like the sound of a bell, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so classical conditioning was discovered. We see how this works with animals, but how does it work with humans? In exactly the same way. Let's say that one day you go to the doctor to get a shot. She says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit," and then gives you the most painful shot you've ever had. A few weeks later, you go to the dentist for a checkup. He starts to put a mirror in your mouth to examine your teeth, and he says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit." Even though you know the mirror won't hurt, you jump out of the chair and run screaming from the room. When you went to get a shot, the words, "this won't hurt a bit," became a conditioned stimulus when they were paired with the pain of the shot, the unconditioned stimulus, which was followed by your conditioned response of getting the heck out of there. Classical conditioning in action. Operant conditioning explains how consequences lead to changes in voluntary behavior. So how does operant conditioning work? There are two main components in operant conditioning: reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcers make it more likely that you'll do something again, while punishers make it less likely. Reinforcement and punishment can be positive or negative, but this doesn't mean good and bad. Positive means the addition of a stimulus, like getting dessert after you finish your veggies, and negative means the removal of a stimulus, like getting a night of no homework because you did well on an exam. Let's look at an example of operant conditioning. After eating dinner with your family, you clear the table and wash the dishes. When you're done, your mom gives you a big hug and says, "Thank you for helping me." In this situation, your mom's response is positive reinforcement if it makes you more likely to repeat the operant response, which is to clear the table and wash the dishes. Operant conditioning is everywhere in our daily lives. There aren't many things we do that haven't been influenced at some point by operant conditioning. We even see operant conditioning in some extraordinary situations. One group of scientists showed the power of operant conditioning by teaching pigeons to be art connoisseurs. Using food as a positive reinforcer, scientists have taught pigeons to select paintings by Monet over those by Picasso. When showed works of other artists, scientists observed stimulus generalization, as the pigeons chose the Impressionists over the Cubists. Maybe next they'll condition the pigeons to paint their own masterpieces.
So there you saw the video and the difference between operant and classical conditioning. And
Psychologists define learning as a long-lasting
we'll
change
go
in
ahead
behavior
and
as a result of
continue with
experience.
the PowerPoint.
Classical and operant conditioning
One
both lead to
second,
learning.
please.
So what's the difference between them? Classical conditioning was first described by Ivan Pavlov and is the association of a
There are so many videos you can find online on classical and operant conditioning. I would advise you to go ahead and watch this, the one we just watched. Watch it over and over again. Classical conditioning, as they mentioned, has to do with involuntary behavior, and operant conditioning has to do with voluntary behavior. Now, the other part of the PowerPoint has to do with observational learning. So we've looked at classical conditioning and how it affects learning. We've looked at operant conditioning and how it affects learning. And now we're looking at observational learning. And this is learning that occurs when a person observes and imitates behavior through modeling. So you model somebody's behavior. And Albert Bandura is the one who is responsible, who was responsible of doing this experiment. I will go ahead and show you a video on the experiment so that you can better understand what it entails. Please listen keenly and watch it as carefully as possible.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. The model pummeled the doll with the mallet, flung it in the air.
This is the adult actually doing that to the Bobo doll.
Kicked it repeatedly. Threw it down and beat it.
You notice this is a child when the child went in the room.
It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively. The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. Children in the control group who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. Here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
So there you have it. That was Albert Bandura's research that he made on the Bobo doll experiment. And as he mentioned, before doing that experiment, people believe that once you watch a video with aggressive behaviors, then it would drain your own aggression and it would cause you not to be aggressive. But they found quite the opposite in this video, in this research. They found out that these kids started modeling the adult's behavior. The adult was placed in the room and the adult started punching the Bobo doll. And she had kids observing her. And when they put in the kids in the room, they started doing exactly the same thing. And some even went to the extent of getting a gun, a play gun, and using it on the Bobo doll as well. So as adults and you taking this psychology class, it's very important because it makes us realize that children are modeling our behavior, and thus we must try to behave the best that we can, because children are like sponges and they're actually watching everything that we're doing. So it's very important to learn about these research that have been carried out. So this brings us to the end of chapter 7. Chapter 7, like I said, included classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. And here is just a summary of the chapter. We looked at operant conditioning, stimulus, response, consequence. We looked at classical conditioning, which dealt with association between two stimuli: conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. And then we looked at those terms: generalization, discrimination. And then last but not least, we looked at observational learning with Albert Bandura. So that brings us to the end of chapter 7. I would want you to please review the section on learning and health and wellness. So with that in mind, we move on to chapter 8, which is behavior in social and cultural context. So now we want to see, we've looked at how people learn, we looked at involuntary behavior, we looked at voluntary behavior. Now we want to see what happens when people are around others. But before we do so, we need to look at some terms, and such as roles and rules, norms. Today we're going to be covering roles and rules, social influences on beliefs, individuals in groups, and group identity. And then for next session, we're going to be looking at group conflict and prejudice, and we will be starting chapter 9 as well. Chapter 9 has to do with psychological disorders. If any of you would like to read up in advance, you are more than welcome to do so. So let's look at some definitions. The first one which we need to look at is norms. And you might be wondering, what are norms? Norms are rules that regulate human life, including social conventions, explicit laws, and implicit cultural standards. Every organization has norms. Every place that you go, you'll find that there are norms. There are rules that we follow as humans. For example, a norm at the Corozal Junior College would be that you're expected to wear your ID upon entering the school campus. Another norm at at our school would be that you are expected to log into Moodle and get information for your specific course. These are all norms. Another definition you need to know is role. Role is a given social position that is governed by a set of norms for proper behavior. Roles change depending on the place where you are. For instance, your role at school is that of a student. That's your position, and for that position you have a set of norms, what you're expected to do as a student. Your role in your family would be that of a child. You're a part of that family. So depending on the circumstances, you'd play different roles. Another word you need to know is culture. And culture is a program of shared rules that govern the behavior of members of a community or society, and a set of values, beliefs, and attitudes shared by most members of that community. For example, we all know that the culture at the sixth form level is totally different from the culture at the high school level. At the sixth form level, the culture is totally different, where you have more freedom. You don't have to stay on campus the whole day. You don't have classes one after the other. So it's a totally different culture. And with that, it is important to note that some students find it hard to adapt to a different culture. So as individuals, we need to find a way to help students adapt to the different cultures. And it could be a culture that has to do with race as well, not just a different culture between high school and sixth form level. So here I have a question. As part of an experiment on learning, you are told to administer an electric shock to another participant every time that participant misremembers a series of words. As the experiment proceeds, the amount of electricity you are administering rises. You started at 15 volts, but the switchboard goes up to 300. How far would you go before you refuse to continue? So how far would you go? That's a question I've always asked in my class, my different classes, the different groups that I have met with. And many would say, Miss, I would just do the 15 and that's it. I would not go all the way. However, believe it or not, there has been a study that has been done. It's called the obedience study. It was done by Stanley Milgram and other co-workers, and they investigated whether people would follow orders even when the order violated your ethical standards. In the research that he did, he found out that most people are far more obedient than anyone expected. Every single participant complied with at least some orders to shock another person. 2/3 shocked the learner to the full extent. So this obedience study is actually an eye-opener, because it was a study where somebody was placed behind a wall, so you couldn't see the person, and you would ask the person questions to remember certain words, and every time the person got it wrong, the researcher would ask you to shock the person. Now, you couldn't see the person. Of course, due to ethical reasons, the person was not shocked for real. He was pretending at the back that he was being shocked whenever you changed the vote. But what left Stanley Milgram in awe was that most of the persons that were told to shock the person behind the wall, most of them went all the way to the most votes that they could have used. Why did this happen? Why were people willing to go against their ethical standards and do this? There were some times when people would disobey. They would not shock the other person. For instance, when the experimenter left the room and they were supposed to continue shocking, they didn't. So once this authority figure was not in the room, then they disobeyed. They disobeyed also when the learner was in the same room. When there wasn't a wall dividing them, they didn't go all the way in shocking the person. I guess they felt sorry for the person. When the experimenter issued conflicting orders, they didn't do it as well. When the person ordering them to continue was an ordinary man, you see, as individuals, we tend to obey when it comes to people that are in a high, have high standards, or they're in a high rank in society. But once it's an ordinary person, we do not obey. And when the subject worked with peers who refused to go on. So these were factors which led to them disobeying, to them not shocking the person all the way. There is another very interesting study that was done. It's called the prison study. And here subjects were physically and mentally healthy young men who volunteered to participate for money. They were randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards. Those assigned the role of prisoners, after a while they became distressed, helpless, and panicky. And those assigned the role of guards became either nice, tough but fair, or tyrannical. As an assignment, you need to view the video that's on Moodle. It's called the prison study, and it needs to be done individually. Each person will be doing an analysis of the prison study. I can tell you that this study had to be ended after 6 days because it became very unethical. The prisoners actually started suffering depression, some of them. And the guards started to act the role in the sense that they had their uniform, their shades, their hat, and they just got into the role that they are in authority, so they became very abusive towards the prisoners. So it's very important that you watch this video because you have an assignment. It's due for next class session. So for instance, the psychology second year groups, I will meet with you again on Wednesday. So please, well, let me put a due date for everybody for the same. This prison study is due on Thursday by midnight. Please, this Thursday by midnight, which would be the 2nd of April 2020. So we move on. Factors in obedience. These are 4 factors that causes people to obey according to research that has been done. When you allocate responsibility to the authority, the authority is asking me to do so I will obey. There is somebody in high rank and I need to follow orders. Routinizing the tasks. People obeyed too because they saw it as a routine. It's something that needed to be done. People also obey because they want to be polite. They don't want to rustle anybody's feathers, and they've been asked to do something, so they go ahead and do it. And lastly, but very interesting, is becoming entrapped. And in psychology, entrapment is a process in which individuals escalate their commitment to a course of action to justify their investment of time, money, or effort. An example of this would be relationships where husband and wife have been together for 20 years, for instance, and it's not working. The relationship is very dysfunctional, but they refuse to leave the relationship because they're entrapped in that relationship. And then there you have obedience. They believe that they have invested so much time in that relationship that they choose not to leave, unfortunately. So those are factors in obedience. And we also need to look at social cognition when we're looking at how people behave in society. And social cognition is an area in social psychology concerned with social influences on thought, memory, perception, and other cognitive processes. So researchers are interested in how people's perceptions of themselves and others affect their relationships, their thoughts, their beliefs, their values. whatever thinking is happening in your mind will definitely affect how you relate to others. If in your mind you believe that you're not worth it or you're not good enough, this will show up when you're relating to other people. For instance, you might have this young lady, very beautiful young lady, but every time she has been told that she's not beautiful, so she keeps thinking about that in her mind. So the minute she gets into a relationship with someone, her boyfriend for example, she looks at herself as being fortunate that he even looked at her. So that would affect her thoughts, affects her relationships. It affects your thoughts as well, because then you keep thinking that you're not good enough. You keep thinking that you're lucky that somebody talks to you. It affects your beliefs. It affects your values. So social cognition is very important. How we view ourselves affects everything else in our lives. We need to look at attributions as well. And the attribution theory states that people are motivated to explain own and others' behavior by attributing causes of behavior to situations or dispositions. And let me give you an example of that. It says, why is Aurelia so mean and crabby lately? The situational reason for it would be she's under pressure. And then the dispositional one would say she's self-involved and clueless. You see, the situational is putting the reason why she is that way because of the situation she's under. She's not always like that. And then the dispositional is saying no, she's like that because she's self-involved and clueless. And then the dispositional may lead to fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency to overestimate personality factors and underestimate situational influence. So ignoring the influence of situation on behavior and emphasizing personality traits alone. The situational is healthier than the dispositional, because if you attribute your things that are happening in your lives, if you just attribute it to the situation and said, oh, it's like that because of something that happened, and it's not something coming from inside. Because if it's something coming from inside, the dispositional, then we're overestimating the personality factors and totally ignoring the situational influence. In attributions, we have the self-serving bias. And this is a tendency for us as humans to take credit for one's good actions, but to rationalize one's mistakes. If you've been observing people ever since you started taking this psychology class, we see this happening. Some of us are guilty of this. When things go good in our lives, we say, oh, that's because of me, I did well in that course because I studied hard, because I behaved good in class, I pay attention. But then the minute that you fail the course, then what happens? We tend to rationalize our mistakes. We say, oh, I didn't do well in the class because the teacher didn't like me, or because the teacher had favorites, or because the teacher didn't know what she was teaching. So that's what we call the self-serving bias. We give credit for one's good things, but we rationalize one's mistakes. And it's not healthy. If we want to improve as humans, we need to take responsibility for our actions. If we didn't do well, don't put blame on others, especially if you didn't put your all in that course. Then there's the just world hypothesis. Many people need to believe that the world is fair and that justice is served. Bad people are punished and good people rewarded. Of course, we don't have a just world. The world is not fair. And there are people that believe, yes, people need to be punished and people need to be rewarded every time, but it does not happen. So it's not a just world. So here I have a question. Your roommate studies hard for the psychology test, but does not do very well. After receiving the results, she says it really wasn't a fair test. What sort of bias is reflected in this attribution? Well, we just went over it. Is a self-serving bias. The person is rationalizing why she didn't do well, blaming the teacher and not taking responsibility for her actions. And we find that on a regular basis, sadly, but it's true. But as psychology students, we need to be aware of this, and so that we could look at the world in a different way and not make excuses for our mistakes, but take responsibility. Attitudes are relatively stable opinion containing beliefs and emotional feelings about a topic. Explicit attitudes, we are aware of them, they shape our conscious decisions. These are things that we know that we possess and we know how it affects us. And implicit, many a times we are unaware of them and they influence our behavior in ways we do not recognize. And many times you might find your friends or your significant other telling you, you know what, you have an attitude when it comes to this particular topic. And for you, you're like, no, I don't. But many a times we can't see it and other people see it in us. So it's very important to have somebody who could do that critical analysis of our behavior and help us to shape our future behavior later on. Factors influencing attitude change in the social environment. You know, many a times when the environment shifts or you're going to a different environment, then your attitude changes as well. The change in behaviors, you as a person saying, you know what, I have this attitude, I need to look at what I can do to become a better person. So I start changing my behavior, seeing what I can do to be more stable and to take responsibility once more for my actions. And the need for consistency would cause why you would change your attitude. Cognitive dissonance, a state of tension that develops when a person simultaneously holds two contradictory cognitions, or when a person's belief is incongruent with his or her behavior. That this is saying is that many times we have certain beliefs about certain things, but our behavior shows otherwise, and then it would cause chaos in our lives. So it's important that we change our attitude so that we don't have cognitive dissonance in our lives, because it's not healthy. Influencing attitudes, effective ways to influence attitudes. And you can find this in ads that are done for specific brands of clothes, specific restaurants. There are three factors that influence our attitudes or how we see things. Repetition of an idea or assertion. Many a times you see on TV this ad on Coca-Cola. So they want to change your attitude towards Coke and they want you to buy the product from them. So they repeat the ad over and over and over and over again until they can get to influence your attitude towards Coke. They make it look so nice that you want to have a Coke. So after watching it so many times, you go and buy the Coke. Right? And then they usually use or endorse it by an admired or attractive person. They would put a beautiful girl drinking Coca-Cola, or a beautiful girl advertising a shampoo and her hair looks so healthy that it influences your attitude and you say, oh, I want to buy that brand of shampoo. Must be good because her hair looks pretty. And then in ads as well, to change your attitudes, they associate the message with a good feeling. You know, they would have the person drinking the Coca-Cola and the person feeling happy and being around their family members so happy. So then it will cause you once more to want to purchase that Coca-Cola or that whatever product it is that they are advertising. So see, that's psychology in play. That's them having you change your attitude when it comes to particular topics, foods, restaurants, products, etc. Next, when it comes to this chapter, we need to look at coercive persuasion. Person is under physical or emotional duress. Person's problems are reduced to one simple explanation, repeated often. Leader offers unconditional love, acceptance, and attention. what this is saying, this is when they use coercive persuasion. They use this technique to get you to change the way you see things. And what the leader would do, or the person trying to change you, they offer unconditional love for you. They make you feel that you're the best in this world. They give you acceptance. They give you all the attention you need. And the new identities based on group is created. And then later on, the person becomes entrapped. And the person's access to information is controlled. You're being controlled by somebody else without you even realizing it. That's coercive persuasion. Persuade you to do something that you didn't want to do in the beginning, but because of the attention they gave you and probably the low self-esteem that you had at that moment, will cause you to follow this person. Here's a research that was done, and subjects in groups were asked to match line lengths, and they gave them the test line, which you could see on the left hand side, and they gave them 3 options, A, B, and C. And they had somebody in the research acting as a confederate. This person chose a wrong line. They chose it on purpose. And what they noticed is that subjects went with the wrong answer in 37% of the trials. And what that is telling us, it's so important to look at this research. Conformity. We as humans, we tend to conform to what others are doing. And we know that it is wrong. For instance, they asked the test line, which one is similar to the test line? As we look at it, we can see that it is A. It's the same answer. And the confederate would say it's B. And you can see that B is smaller than the test line. But because you notice that the person said B and said it so confidently, with a lot of confidence, and you look around and you see everybody else answering B, and then we tend to conform as humans. We say, okay, it's B, when deep down inside we know it's not B. So sadly, as humans, we tend to do this in real life scenarios. We might not be in agreement with certain things that are happening, but because somebody in authority said it's like that, or the majority of people are saying it's like that, then you conform to what you're saying. And psychologically talking, this is bad for somebody's ego. It's not healthy. Conformity has decreased since 1950, possibly due to changing norms. The good news is that this has decreased. We're not as conformist as our ancestors used to be before. If we don't agree with it, we say it. Groupthink. This is very important as well in psychology. In close-knit groups, the tendency of all members to think alike and suppress disagreement for the sake of harmony. Let me repeat it. In close-knit groups, the tendency for all members to think alike and suppress disagreement for the sake of harmony. Symptoms of that, what that is saying is that once we're in a group and the majority of a group believes a certain way, then as humans we tend to go ahead with what they're saying because we don't want any disagreement. Symptoms is illusion of invincibility, self-censorship, pressure on dissenters to conform, and illusion of anonymity. So once we know these things, then we can become better persons, and we can say, even though the majority are saying this and we know it's wrong, we need to step up to the plate and say, no, it's wrong, and I will not be a part of groupthink, not because everybody is seeing it that way, it is that way. It's not by majority. Very interesting as well is the anonymous crowd. Several research that has been done shows that when we are in groups, we avoid taking responsibility for actions or decisions because we assume others will do it. This is a diffusion of responsibility. You know, we see some a fight happening on campus, and so many people are around. Research has proven that once a lot of persons are around, we tend to wait for somebody else to help. We don't go and help. People fail to call for help when others are near. When people work less in the presence of others, forcing others to work harder. This is the other one is social loafing, and this happens a lot in groups, and I've heard many group members complain about this. We have social loafing. You might have a group of 5 persons working together, and you have these 1 or 2 persons not working because they're waiting for somebody else to do the work, and which is very unfair. That's social loafing. You work less because others are working harder. For assignment and for today's classwork, I want you to look up an ad that has been done, and I want you to email that ad to me by tomorrow midnight. I want this ad to show these 3 factors coming into play in how they try to influence our attitudes. A video ad. So that is for the remaining 8 minutes. That's your classwork. Please email that to me tomorrow by midnight, and then you have another assignment that is for Thursday by midnight, the prison study. So just to review on what we did today, we did some definitions, the roles, rules, norms. We looked at the obedience study and how people tend to obey, and the reasons why they obeyed and reasons when they didn't obey. The prison study, we briefly looked at it because this is an assignment that you have for Thursday at midnight. And we look at the attribution theory, attitudes, ways our attitudes are influenced, the 3 ways: repetition of an idea, endorsement by an admired attractive person, associating the message with a good feeling. And then we looked at coercive persuasion, conformity. As humans, we tend to conform to what others are saying or doing. Groupthink. Once we're in a group, we tend to think like others in that group. Anonymous crowd. We tend to diffuse our responsibility. When we are in a crowd, we wait for somebody else to do what needs to be done. So for next class, we will be looking at group identity, ethnocentrism, and Robert's cave. Please find some time to review this Robert's cave. If you could go ahead and look at the video on it, it would be very good so that we could easily understand it for our next session. As I said before, our next session will include finishing chapter 8, which we started today, and then we're going to begin chapter 9, which has to do with psychological disorders. Thank you guys. It was a pleasure being with you today, and please go ahead and do your assignments. Thank you.